We had some really interesting thoughts about what is Israel. We talked about it actually being a physical space. We talked about it with boundaries. We talked about it as a kind of like a spiritual destiny with a commandment of ethical responsibility. We've also talked about it as a political reality that's in relation to the other nations of the world. And all of these things are constantly being tested, reformulated. They're being affirmed and challenged throughout the conversations that we read every single day. So it's important for us to keep in mind when we're talking about Israel, what Israel we are talking about. It's very easy to get that confused. In fact, it's probably the source of more contention than it is of resolution. And it's helpful that when you're in a conversation with people and you're trying to talk to your middle-aged children or your teenage grandchildren, or somebody who's just got a totally different perspective, or a peer who is like just indefatigably supportive of Israel unconditionally, and really even when there are questions or concerns that are raised about the behavior of the state, how to be able to speak to a person to let them know that you hear them, but also that you don't have to agree with what they say in order for you to share a common understanding. So that's what we're going to be working on in our upcoming classes. The way that I've structured the class is that we're going to talk about kind of, how do we get here? And we're going to talk about it from a historical perspective. We'll talk about it from a political perspective. And then we'll talk about where do we go from here. So, and then we'll do that as well, not only from the kind of like how we got here, but then we're going to talk about like what's happening now. And then we're going to talk about like what are the conversations about where we really go. And it's not about boundaries, or it's about the politics, but really it's about this like grand idea of what Israel comes to mean for us. That's why we are so interested in the subject. It's more than just a political conversation. It's more than just a conversation around a coffee table about who's running for the prime minister, or what's the problem with all of the BDS anti-Israel sentiment on college campuses. It's more than that. And the more that we can be able to speak in that larger voice, the more effective we are in reaching our own understandings and even a better understanding of what Israel means to us. So let me start with some stuff from our text. Let me see. Here it is. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Good. I'm going to make it nice and big for us. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to study a little bit about the Torah, and this is like, so how did we get here? Okay. And how did we get to talking about Israel, which is this like, magnificent but also contentious place on the planet? Okay. And it starts in the Bible. So Roberta asked, would you like to start reading?
Yes. In the steppes of Moab, at the Jordan near Jericho, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israeli people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land. You shall destroy all their figured objects. You shall destroy all their molten images, and you shall demolish all their cult places. And you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have assigned the land to you to possess. You shall apportion the land among yourselves by lot, clan by clan. With larger groups, increase the share. With smaller groups, reduce the share. Whatever the lot falls for it, that shall be its location. You shall have your portions according to your ancestral tribes. But if you do not dispossess the inhabitants of the land, those whom you allow to remain shall be stings in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land in which you live, so that I will do to you what I plan to do to them."
Thank you. So I didn't pick you as a reader to sort of like, like as a political statement, but it's a very, very, laden text with many layers of commandment, but also reasoning. There's a rationale. So just take a look, absorb it for a moment, and then let's discuss. Okay? So the question that we have is, this is the sort of like, this is different than there's plenty of texts that say, I'm going to bring you to a promised land. It's going to be flowing with milk and honey. Excuse me. And you'll build me a place there, and it'll be a blessing for you, right? There's that message, which is kind of a spiritual message of the land, but this one is very, very specific. And it also has in its specificity a very clear directive about the land itself. So what is it that we're seeing? What's your takeaway? This is the Torah, right? So this is the commandment that's given to the people. This is our text that we read year after year after year. So therefore, it's kind of ingrained within us that this is part of our story. Our story will change throughout history, but this is the historical foundation of the sort of like foundation of the land of Israel, and later the state of Israel. So what is it that you see? What are some of the things that are kind of like important about this, Judy?
Well, I see that it's Adonai who started the whole mess, and that what happened to live and let live and all of that. This really bothers me, this whole thing.
It's so interesting because a live and let live attitude does not actually kind of come onto the scene, the ideological scene, until several centuries after this moment. So if you want to take it from a historical slice, this is a moment where people are responsible to, or they're responsive to a higher power. They identify a deity that has a commanding voice, and that this commanding voice has a very particular purpose or function for the people. Go to this land, right? And it maybe in your sort of like pseudo-atheistic attitude, you're like, I'm really angry at a God that would command me to go and dispossess a bunch of people, right? That seems a little bit challenging. Roberta P.
You're muted.
Okay. I keep on going back to the thinking that this is the Torah, and if we don't totally believe that God wrote the Torah, gave us this Torah, if it was man who did this, then it's a lot of men who are writing this to get what they want, to rationalize this. So when I get a portion that seems like God would never do this, my mind goes back to, well, then it probably was guys writing this whole story.
Sure, right, and putting the sort of authority in the mouth of God.
Right.
Right. So it's not that there isn't a God. It's that this is the human being trying to interpret what they understand to be divine imperative, divine command, and their understanding was the divine command. Now to add support to your point, Roberta, and also to put Judy's comment into context, there is a lot of historical and archaeological evidence that the Torah was written many centuries after the moments that it happened. So while we're hearing this happen chronologically, or it feels like, once upon a time there was a group of people that were enslaved in Egypt. They cried out to God, God responded to them, and then history began as they were marching towards the promised land. That seems to be one way to tell the story. But if you understand that it was a reflection back on those moments, part of the explanation is an explanation of how did we get into the land that we possess today. And the answer, like you said, Roberta, is a rationalization. We got into the land today because God commanded us to say, get rid of all the other people that are in existence. And if you don't, they're going to be a sting in your eye and a thorn in your side. Well, how would you know that it's going to be a sting in your eye and a thorn in your side? Because you've experienced the sting and the thorn, right? It's like it. Most kids, if you tell them don't touch the hot stove, they won't touch the hot stove. But what happens if you tell the kid don't touch the hot stove? What's the thing that the kid's going to do immediately?
Touch the stove.
Touch the stove, right? So there's something to this story, this way that is being explained, that is a an explanation, a rationalization of the experience that they currently have. That's one way of looking at it. Roberta asks.
Having read this, it seems that God is not very gentle and not nice. You know, he's just the men portray, whoever wrote this portrayed God as doing really nasty things, I think.
Well, there is a feeling that like God says you have to dispossess the people.
Yes, not
So
nice.
that's the thing that I think we're all stuck on right now, is that God says all the people in the land have to be
I think I do.
they have to be they have to be kicked out. And if you don't kick them out, then you're going to suffer because they're going to constantly be a pain in your tuchus, right? Because they don't believe, they don't believe in me. That's the issue, right? The issue is, why is it a problem for the people? Why isn't it a live and let live? Because God couldn't be God in the land of Israel with those other people. That's the problem. So God says, get rid of the other people so I can be the God in that land. Now you would say, that sounds mean. Or you could also say, from a positive, not in a happy, but in a positive and an affirmative perspective, that effort was necessary because the message of this particular God or this identity or this sort of evolving civilization had at its core a different way of behaving that required that other people were a part of it. And if they couldn't be a part of it because they couldn't conform to it, then they had to be dispossessed. Okay? That's another way of reading it. I'm not putting judgment one way or the other, just trying to understand. Candy, go ahead and unmute yourself too.
Well, although it does also say you shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land, you destroy. It seems like in context, the whole thing is the supremacy of the one God, You know, everything was, you had to destroy the molten images. And it was the evilest thing you could do is to have, the worst thing you can do is to have another God before them. So the question is all the inhabitants, if they believed in the one Lord, would you still have to get rid of them?
Right.
And that's an interesting, they don't make a distinction whether you believe in God, in the one God, in our God, or whether it just doesn't matter.
Right. Well, it's wonderful, and we're going to see a little bit of that in the text that we read a little later on. But there is this sense that, and it's very present throughout the entire Tanakh, the rest of the Bible. When you hear the stories after they enter the land, and all the times that they fall from their loyalty to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, to the God of Israel that brought them to the land, and they go and worship other idols, and that there's punishment that comes as a result. The very concept from its outset seems to, first of all, this seems to be a very clear thing that you're supposed to do, right? And then the practice of it is, at least historically, was never effective. It was never effective. Before I call on Jay, Judy, I saw your hand. I just want to make sure did you have something to add? Or are you okay right now?
I'm okay.
All right, good. Jay. And then Barbara, are you okay?
To me, it seems that these instructions are very pragmatic, because basically our experience has been that when you are not the majority and you're living with other people, it doesn't go well for the Jews. So this is sort of an explanation about why we needed to get rid of these other people, because they become, in our history, they become thorns in our sides, and
Yeah, so is there a question about that? That's the one question about, and for those who read the Noah Jacoby book, right? It's a really great comment, and I actually took a clip out when you're talking about the question of apartheid, right? An apartheid state, by definition, we'll come back to this concept, but I'll bring it up now. An apartheid state is when you have a vast minority overwhelming a majority with very strict prohibitions and with isolationist tactics, because they have some kind of like either economic power or they have some kind of social power that subjugates a larger population. That's not exactly what's happening here. What's happening here is that you have probably a very large population coming to occupy a bunch of smaller groups. And what I want to make sure is clear is that it's not that they should be killed, right? This isn't about genocide. This is about dispossession. That says, we are taking over this land. You are no longer the inhabitants of this land because our God wants us to be in this land. And the consequence of that is that you can either join us or you can leave. And that seems to be the kind of story that's in the Torah about taking on the land. And it's important that we hold on to it. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be that way, right? First of all, it is. That's the thing. There's nothing we can always revise history, but you can't revise this part of history. It's all about what happens next. Okay? Any other comments on this? Yeah. Jeannie and then Judy.
A number of years ago, when when we took this class from Benjamin Acosta through Milton about Israel and all the players in the area, he talked about the fact that that was definitely an option of expelling all that, and that was often seen as a way of eliminating all of this conflict. And he pointed out this is not unheard of historically. I mean, we have India and Pakistan as an example where they just could not come to an agreement, where these two religious sects could, but the Muslims and the Hindus could live side by side. And so they just chose to literally expel all the Hindus from India and create what exists today. I don't know how great that's worked out for them, but that was it. As Jay said, very pragmatic. We can't live together, so we're just going to separate.
Yeah, and even in the United States, right? We have this a part of our history, and so it's important to understand that I think it's about we have a challenge, because in 2022 we understand the sort of geopolitical implications of that behavior in our day. Maybe we have the comfort and convenience of wishing it differently, because we don't have an imperative to kick out a group of people. I was going to say something, and I chuckled about it, and I'm not going to say it, but it is a very pressing and very real solution to a problem, right? You have differing points of view and differing ways of life, so how do you deal with them, right? Judy, do you want to add something there?
I just am stuck on the word inhabitants, because they were already there.
Sure.
And like you said, with what we did to the Native Americans, but also when you said that they said you could, they had the choice of joining them or leaving. Is that the fact that they really could join us?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And there's plenty of stories in biblical literature of groups of people, making alliances, and then also not, right? So that's part of what you read in Joshua and Judges, is where groups they're valued for their unique tribal identity, but they're also ones that create strategic partnerships. And King Solomon, as a figure, later in the book of Judges becomes the pinnacle of strategic partnerships. And he's making partnerships with people in all kinds of lands. He's marrying all these women, right? Which is their way of saying we're making strategic, alliances, political alliances. So it's that's another side of the story that we'll get to when we talk about the politics of it. What we're trying to understand is sort of, how did we get here? And the last piece, Judy, that's important in your point is that while these people were also dwelling in the land, we also have story of our ancestors of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob who were in the land as well. And when Abraham went to the land of Canaan, there were people living there. So it's not like it was an empty, desolate desert. It's always been a place where there's been people. But what's happening is you have a confederation of tribes. You have a formation of a national identity taking place. That's where the invitation to say, join us or leave, is presented. Okay? So this is our first text. Now, this is, obviously, as we talked a little bit about this, the people can't sustain the covenant that is made with Yod Vav He, especially when it comes to the relationship to land. So it says, right, in this last one in Numbers, it says, if you don't dispossess these people, there'll be stings in your eyes and thorn in your sides, and they'll harass you in the land which you live, and I will do to you what I plan to do to them, which means that you will be dispossessed. And so Israel is exiled twice, right? And the first time they're exiled to Babylonia. And in that Babylonian exile, we have this psalm, which is a reflection of the very important longing for a return to this land. So, Jay, would you like to read it? Psalm 126.
When the Lord restores the fortunes of Zion, we see it as in a dream. Our mouths shall be filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then shall they say among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord will do great things for us, and we shall rejoice. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like water courses in the Negev. They who sow in tears shall reap with songs of joy. Though he goes along weeping, carrying the seed bag, he shall come back with songs of joy, carrying his sheaves.
Okay, thanks. Just take a look at the words and absorb them for a while. It's poetry. It comes from the book of Psalms. And you might even be familiar with the melody that we sing, because we sing this psalm every time that we celebrate a meal on Shabbat. We sing Shir Hamalo Beshuv Adonai Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kechomim. Right? You remember the melody or something like that? There's Shir Hamalo Beshuv Adonai Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kechomim. It's like Adon Olam. There's like 5-6 melodies that exist, and they're all beautiful in their own way, despite my my very dramatic presentation. So when you see these words, right, look at what it says, right? First of all, God's going to bring us back, right? We know that God's going to bring us back because we were exiled, and God has an everlasting covenant with the people of Israel. Okay? The relationship of God with the people of Israel is everlasting. It's a covenant made with Abraham 4,000 years ago, right? And it's a relationship that continues to thrive even today because of this feeling, right? When we returned, we were like in a dream, right? And God has done great things for us to enable us to be back in this place. We'll be joyful, okay? So return us, restore our fortunes, and even though you have sown in tears, because this journey has been filled with suffering along the way, you'll come back to the land of Zion with joy, okay? Robust with the produce of all that you have gained from that which at once led you into exile. So this is a beginning of a sentiment, and the next two texts that we're going to read are going to also offer some shaping from it, one from the Quran and then one from Yehuda Levi. And the reason that I brought this is that when you're talking about the history of the land, so you have this story in the book of Numbers, and then you have an exile, and you have a longing for a return to the land of Israel, and you have some affirmation that there will always be a presence of Israel, the people Israel, in this land. You don't get that only from Jewish texts, but you get that from the Quran alone. So, Judy, Solomon, do you want to read this from the Quran?
Hold on. Just gotta hang up my phone. Indeed, we settled the children of Israel in a blessed land and granted them good lawful provisions. They did not differ until knowledge came to them. Surely your Lord will judge between them on the day of judgment regarding their differences. If you, O prophet, are in doubt about these stories that we've revealed to you, then ask those who read the scripture before you. The truth has certainly come to you from your Lord, so do not be one of those who doubt, and do not be one of those who deny Allah's signs, or you will be one of the losers.
Okay, now I don't speak Arabic, and I don't know the Quran in its original language, and I just was able to find this in English. So this is one of the texts that is actually sort of an affirmation that when you're talking about the land of Israel, it's not just that the Jewish people are telling this story. It's not that this is only like a narrative for one group of people, and so therefore the rationale for the land comes from the people who want it that way. Roberta P., right? It's not just simply alone, even though I know what you were saying, and I don't take it as a critique. I'm just saying that this is a proof, this is an affirmation that there were other voices that also understood that Israel was a land for these people who were in covenant with, here Allah or with Yud He Vav He. Okay? The other thing that you should also see is that, and I love this, okay, is that it mirrors the story that is told in the Hebrew Bible. The story in the Hebrew Bible is the people were given a land. They break their covenant by like worshiping other gods. God exiles them, or allows the Assyrians and the Babylonians to come and destroy them and send them off into exile. And God also promises that they'll return, because that is God's everlasting promise. Okay, and what it says is that you should believe in it. That's an interesting thing, right? I mean, the Quran as a text, if you haven't studied it before, has a very different spiritual, ideological goal than the Torah. But it's very much focused in messages like this. Believe in this. Understand the truth. Know that what I'm telling you is the truth. And here I'm just going to keep on reiterating that truth for you. So when you read the Quran, you get a lot of that. By the way, this comes from, if you see the Quran, Surah Yunus. Yunus is Jonah. So this is the story of the prophet Jonah, who goes to the story, if you remember the Jonah story, because we're going to read it in Yom Kippur. He goes to the city of Nineveh. Nineveh is in Babylonia, and he says, repent or die. And guess what the people do? They repent. So here is almost a mirroring of that story, where it says, you could read it and understand it, that just like Jonah told the people of Nineveh to repent, and they repented, that the belief that the children of Israel have a place in the land is something that you should believe in. Because if you don't, according to this, I don't know what losers is in Arabic for the Quran, but you get the idea, right? The idea is, if you don't believe that the Jewish people belong in Israel, you're among the losers. That's what the Quran is saying. So it seems. So I want you to bring that for a second into our moment of what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about history. Okay? Are we talking that there is a place that exists in the world that God promised to these people, that God commanded that other people are dispossessed in the land, and as long as they follow all the rules, they're welcome to stay there. But if they don't follow all the rules, then they're not allowed to stay there. And somehow we would say, well, maybe as compensation for the horrors of the 20th century, that we get this land. But we didn't do it because we deserved it. We did it because it was compensation. It was out of pity for us. You could tell that story. I think a lot of people want to tell that story. That's not the story that's been read in these texts that we've read here. The story that's being told is, this is a place that we have always been longing for. When we had it, it was ours, and it was an everlasting covenant. Even the everlasting covenant is, when we're not there, we want to be back there. And it's not just us that's telling that story, but it's also even the other peoples in the world, even those who come from the Quran. So let me pause and reflect. What do you see? What is it that you see in these texts? What challenges you? What's affirmative for you? What more are you needing to see when it comes to this idea that Israel does indeed, from a historical perspective, even from different vantage points, has a claim to this land? Jay.
Well, if you believe in the Bible and God, it's really very clear that this land was a gift from God and a commandment from God. There doesn't seem to be any ambiguity about it.
And so why is it that we have, would you say, where's the ambiguity that exists today?
Anti-Semitism.
Like, so, but why would there be anti-Semitism? I mean, if God says this is the land, like, why?
Well,
you're not wrong, but like, why?
I mean, there always has been, and there always will be. So,
well, is there a challenge to the fact that God actually has that authority to apportion land on the planet?
Yeah, sure.
That would be the argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other comments? It's a very important sort of like piece, machination that we're trying to figure out here. When you're talking with people and somebody says, look, I mean, it's a lot more modern and we'll get to the subject, but like, Israel is a colonial state, right? They went in and they took over and they kicked all the people out, right? Isn't that what it sounds like when you read this? That it's like, so, is that what kind of feels like what's happening here? That like there's a little colonization happening? What's the difference between colonization and what we're reading? Are we confused by what colonization is?
Yeah.
Okay, fair. So let's just take it from an American perspective. All right, hold on, Lauren, I see you, right? So England is one of the sort of like great colonial empires in history. And basically what they did is they would go to all parts in the world and they would say, you're Britain now. And what they would do is they would set up a government, and basically this was the problem that precipitated the Revolutionary War. There was really no government presence. The monarchy wasn't in the United States. Plus there were these different ideas about the way that they should be living their life. And what happened was there had to be an uprising, there had to be a violent uprising, a revolution, in order to wrestle free from the colony, the colonial force of Britain, the colony, to create its own entity. Where are the other Jewish colonies in the world? Borough Park, right? I mean, Muncie, right? Like, where are the other Jewish colonies in the world? Jeannie?
Zabars.
Yeah, Zabars, right? Exactly.
Fairfax.
Cantor's Deli on Fairfax. Is that what we're talking about?
Parts of
Canada.
Right.
I was just gonna say that the other important component of colonization is that they would impose their beliefs, their mores and lifestyle, and exploit these countries, take resources, impose laws, tax these people. I mean, decide that indigenous people had no culture and push their culture upon. So yeah, it wasn't even just enslaved in some cases, these people. So yeah, it wasn't even innocuous. It was pretty oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody got rich. So was God getting rich?
Exactly.
Right, or the and when we talk about Solomon, right, who did expand the sort of like greatness of Israel in the region, Solomon did so with strategic alliances, created partnerships. It wasn't about conquering lands at all. There are battles that are being fought all throughout the Bible, and they're fighting, and they seem to never end, which doesn't surprise us when we look at the modern day state of Israel. But we do understand that what distinguishes a colony is the sense of not only the sort of like the denuding of the resources of the land, but also the sort of sterilization of the culture and a swallowing up of that. We're talking about dispossession. Okay, which doesn't, so it's not conquering. It's an interesting kind of statement. It's different, right? So part of it sounds really problematic. Like, let's send the people out. I mean, there's a problem with that, right? There's nothing to dispute about that. I don't think we have to wholly rationalize that. But what we do have to understand is that what is not taking place here is a repudiation of the cultures. It just simply says, you're not in this land, in this space. No idols, no worship spaces, no pagan worship, none of that stuff. It's going to be God's land, and this is the land that we're going to be using for our people, and we're not really interested in any other place. So, Roberta S., you were okay? I saw your hand raised, and then
I have a quick question. It just seems that this plan is set up to fail, that it's not going to succeed. When you take people and say you're going away, you can't be here, but you don't have any other place for them to go. It's just, they're going to be issues. And there have been, of course. Yeah,
absolutely. I think you're absolutely correct with that. I would say when we're looking at the Torah, what are the things that endure and that are most successful? They are the sort of like the ethical standards, the foundations which make up Judaism that's still thriving today. And it's really the foundation in which the rabbinic tradition is ultimately going to take the concept of Judaism and the civilization that it brings to the world. What it's not going to do is, even though it's going to preserve the land, the boundaries of the land in the text, it's not going to preserve the mentality that we have to go and dispossess people. So when we talk about the modern state and the formation of the modern state, the outcome is not dispossession. And one last thing, we did bring up the concept of indigenous people. I think, and I agree with Noah Tishby and her research on this, if you have a claim to what defines indigenous people, the Israelite people have, and the later, the sort of like, Jewish people and the state of Israel seems to have as valid a claim of indigenous dwelling in this land as any of the other inhabitants at the time. The issue that's at play is they're not allowed to live here at the time that we're allowed to live here. Candice? Unmute. Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking about permanency, permanency, the time in which this was written, and it's like the ascendancy of all of this. Thank you. It was written at a time of ascendancy, and this is, I guess the foundational story, and then what happens during the period of when you say ascendancy, this is what you're entitled to, the governance for, and then the decline, as you wonder whether the land was ever something of permanence.
Yeah.
And where do you get your concept of permanence? By believing in the one, in one God and our law, and that's the concept I'm doing.
You know, I think that such a great comment to put a pin in, because and only that we should keep coming back to that question is what is the definition of permanence? We have visions in the words of the prophets that the lion is going to lie down with the lamb and everybody's going to sit under their own fig tree and their own vineyard, and everybody's going to be at peace, whatever that means, right? Or there's in the book of Jeremiah, we hear it in the wedding, right? That in the hills of Judah, there's going to be sounds of rejoicing and gladness of bride and groom, as if to say that at that time, because that's only a time when everybody's going to be at peace, will there really be sort of a resonance of peace and joy. And the truth is, in any place in the world, I mean, except for maybe Maui, but even Maui has its own stories, right? Like most places on the planet are constant. It's a dynamic. It's constantly changing, and so therefore, in a state of constant change, there's always going to be pushes and pulls. Let's come back to that because it's a big idea. Jay, unmute.
Couple of things. One is, we're reading about our sort of instructions to take over the land and kick the people out. This is a question. Do we know that that actually happened, or did we just move there in large numbers? And, do we know that every single non-Jew was kicked actually out of the land?
Actually, the converse is true. We know that it never happened.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. Number two, as far as the permanence, one of the scariest things about my trip to Israel, when Lori and I went several years ago, was as we went to the museums and we learned about how often this land was ruled by and settled by different people. That this is not permanent. And I'm thinking that if it changes hands one more time, 7 million people are going to be gone. And so I don't think there is permanence, although I hope I'm wrong about that in Israel.
Well, I think that's a beautiful, again, another really great comment and one to sort of hold on to, which is that why is this so the prompting question is, why is this conversation so important? Because there is a sense that there is nowhere else to go. And now the positive of that. Why is this conversation so important? Because what these people do in this land makes the world a better place. So therefore, we need these people to be in this land. And if there is such a thing as a God that gives blessing to people, then it is manifest through the goodness that these people radiate. And look, I'm a faithful person, right? So I understand when we say, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, from Zion, from Israel, from Jerusalem, the words of Torah emanate out into the world. We have a global responsibility to bring this message out into the world, and the locus is in Israel. We're doing a great job in America, but it's not the same. That's the point. Thank you for that comment. Let's hold on. Yeah, Lauren?
I was going to say, but like if you read the Quran, their God gave them the land. So who do you believe? I mean, they believe that the land, that's the problem. Don't they believe?
Where in the Quran does it say?
Well, it says, doesn't it say right here that we settled the children of Israel in the blessed land and granted them good? Can you interpret that they think the land is theirs too?
Only that they're brothers and sisters with the children of Israel, right? Like you have, so it's a great question, right? There is one of the things, Lauren, what you're asking is, and it's one of the problems, is it sounds like there's a tug of war. It sounds like we were here first. We were here first. No, we were here first. No, we were here first. Well, when you start unpacking the layers, what you really understand is that there wasn't the people who say we were here first are not the people that were there back then. Do you understand? That is a very important distinction. So other people.
Other people. And that's
Yes. Yes, and we'll
Yeah,
talk about
Islam
it.
didn't exist yet, right?
Well, so
At
I
that,
don't
at
want
the
to
point that happened, that at the point of the initial Torah reading, I mean, Islam wasn't a thing yet, right?
Oh, not for let's see, 700, not for 2,000 years.
Right,
That's always
so
my problem. Like, what existed?
it's not like that.
So just to be very clear about what we're talking about, when you talk about indigenous people, right? 2,000 years later. Okay, and that is when we're going to talk about us and them, and we'll study that more in depth. But it's important that we hold on to that now, knowing that when we're reading about this land and who belongs to this land. Jeannie, I saw you. I don't know if you wanted to say something. When we talk about this land, it's not about us and them at all at this point. We're just talking about what's the connection the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, has with this land. Okay, Jeannie, do you want to add?
I just want to throw something out that occurred to me through this discussion, and that is, it never says it's going to be easy. I mean, even when we were in, when God first created man and women, and we were in the Garden of Eden, it started out easy. It wasn't easy. When we left Egypt, everybody thought we're free. Everything's 40 years struggles. And so even though God says this is the way ideally I want it to be, there's nothing there that says to me, oh yeah, I'm going to make it easy for you. So maybe this is part of what we're supposed to be doing, is struggling with this. That's just what occurred to me.
Well, we're called Yisrael, right? Right? We're the strugglers. Okay? So there's something profound in the struggle. There's something even like dignified and holy. Like how most people don't want to struggle because the struggle is too hard. Jay, why does the world hate Jews? Because we're difficult, right? We take on tough stuff. And we don't always have the right solutions to it. It's easier to kind of like, blind ourselves to those things. Meanwhile, tyranny and oppression emerge in that space because somebody says, I'll tell you everything you need to know. I'll tell you all the things. I'll solve the problems for you. So I think it's a really important point that you talk about, that this is not, it's easy, right? And that's why it says it'd be easy. Jeannie, it would have been easy if God said, go into the land and kill all those people. Seriously, right? That would have been easy. It would have been horrible, right? That it would have been that's genocide. That's like the least human thing that you could do. And we've seen what that happens in the world. That's not what this story is about, right? This story is, let's figure out how to make it work. Let's try to make it work. Yes, Judy, and then one more thing, and then we'll take a break. Okay.
Can you talk about for a second this line, they did not differ until knowledge came to them?
I love it. Yes, thank you. I would say that's a great line, and I also stumbled on it, and I was like, I'm not an expert in Quran, and so I know how to interpret Torah really well. But all I'm going to do is I'm going to give my my impression of what it meant when I read this, okay? And I would say it's worth studying. So my thought is that the knowledge that the people, it's like in Hamilton. In Hamilton, the play, when after the battle at Yorktown, then the king comes back on and he says, what comes next, right? Because it's really hard to lead, right? You wanted to lead, good for you. It's really hard, right? So there's part of this that is like the people were given the land, and then they had to learn what does it mean to actually live with the responsibility of being agents of God. And I will say they were not successful. And it took 2 exiles. You could even argue that we're still, even in our 3rd return to the land, we are still, our 2nd, formal return to the land, or 3rd return to the land, right? In our 3rd return to the land, we are still learning, but we're learning more. We're learning better. So I think I need to have a better understanding of what knowledge means in that sentence. Don't you agree? Like what's the knowledge that they're talking about? So I'm just going to say that this was knowledge of how to live with the mitzvot, and they didn't do so well. Okay, great point. All right, one quick thing, and then we're going to take a break. All right, so this is now, I just wanted to like bring us, we're about to get to the 19th and 20th century, but before we do that, we have to go to the 12th century in Spain, 1141 more or less. And this is a very famous poem if you haven't read it, and it is, it's from Yehuda Halevi, who was a philosopher and a Jewish commentator and also a wonderful poet. Audrey, would you like to read it?
Sure. Between then and now, my heart is in the east and I the utmost west. How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds? Well, yet Zion lies beneath the fetter of Edom and I in Arab chains. A light would it seem to me to leave all good things of Spain, seeing how precious in my eyes to behold the dust of a desolate sanctuary. It's funny, I was just thinking that it kind of reminded me, what we were just reading reminded me of the expulsion from Spain, of course, before the Crusades and when they started, torturing and killing everybody who didn't convert. But that seemed to me to be a similar concept. Well, if you can stay if you want to convert, but otherwise just leave.
No, otherwise you die, right?
No, well, no, but they expelled everybody.
There was an expulsion, but there was also like
Yeah.
a mass murder taking place.
Yeah. But I think it was, but
Oh, it's a
so
great
that
point. So here is Yehuda Levi, and in this beautiful poem, he says, "My heart is in the east," right? Libi mizrach. It's a very famous concept, right? And what it represents is a longing, a longing for the place, a longing for the sense of freedom, right? I'm like Israel is underneath the fetters of Edom. It's under the control of the Muslims during the Crusades, and then also you have this sense that like where I am, okay, I'm going to leave all these good things. I'm living in America, so to speak, right? Why should I leave all of this good stuff? Because I want to be in the place that's my home. I have a home. I am displaced in the world. And even though I am displaced, my heart is still there, right? It's not like if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. It is, I can't be with the one I love, and I won't be at peace until I am at home. It's this kind of thinking that, look, that's 1140, right? So the Quran is, in the like 700s, I think, or so, 700s, maybe to 1,000, depends on, I'm not certain on the date for the moment. The Psalms is written basically in the 400s before the Common Era. That's where this is possibly written. And then you have the Torah, which is written in the 1300s before the Common Era. So you have this like incredible continuity for at this point in the 11th century, already over 2,000 years of longing. 2,000 years of longing, which is going to bring us to the text that we're going to be studying after the break. Okay? Any comments so far about what we're reading or what we've been discussing so far before we take a little break? Good. Let's take a little break, and we'll see you it's about 11:45, so come back in like 5 to 8 minutes. Okay?
Hey Siri. Set timer 5 minutes.
Okay, everyone. What was that music? What is that music? Um, Candy, I hope you're healthy. Be well. It's great. And welcome back, everybody. All right, so for the remaining moments of our class together today, we're going to shift to a little bit of the sort of how do we get here from the early foundations of what we call Zionism, or the foundation of the state of Israel, and what I think distinguishes it, as we'll learn, is that there's a sense that the place itself has a utility. There's a function to it. So more than it just, and we'll see this, more than just having a place that is the spiritual foundation, as you know, as we mentioned before the break, that like Torah emanates out like a fountain of wisdom from Israel out into the world, in a concept that it actually has something tangible, material, utilitarian in it. And we see this in the early foundations, which ultimately are going to form the Zionist movement, the resettlement movement, in the group called Bilu. Bilu is, as we see on our text, Bilu comes from the text in, as we go to the bottom here, see where the blue line, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 5, Beit Yaakov lechu v'nelcha. Let the house of Jacob go. So this is circa 1882. And this was the message of people who were living in Europe and came to the conclusion that European life was inferior to resettling the land. They also were victims of pogroms. They were victims of isolation and ghettoization of Jewish communities, and they said, enough. And this is before Herzl has his First World Jewish Congress in 1897, but this is certainly the sort of formation of it. And Bilu, as a historical group, they eventually do go to Israel, and they get support from the Rothschild family, which you're familiar with. So let's read a little bit, and we'll see what we can gain from it. Alice, you feel like reading a little bit?
To our brothers and sisters in exile, if I do not help myself, who will help me? Nearly 2,000 years have passed since, in an evil hour, after an heroic struggle, the glory of our temple vanished in fire, and our kings and chieftains exchanged their crowns and diadems for the chains of exile. We lost our country where our beloved ancestors had lived. Into the exile we took with us, of all of our glories, only a spark of the fire by which our temple, the abode of the Great One, was engirdled. And this little spark kept us alive while the towers of our enemies crumbled into dust. And the spark leapt into the celestial flame and illuminated the heroes of our race and inspired them to endure the horrors of the dance of death and the tortures of the autos de fe. And this spark is again kindling and will shine for us a true pillar of fire, going before us on the road to Zion, while behind us is a pillar of cloud, the pillar of oppression threatening to destroy us. Are you asleep, O our nation? What have you been doing until 1882? Sleeping and dreaming the false dream of assimilation. Now, thank God, you have awaked from your slothful slumber. The pogroms have awakened you from your charmed sleep. Your eyes are open to recognize the obscure and delusive hopes. Can you listen in silence to the taunts and mockings of your enemies?
Wonderful. Just pause for a second because it's a great pause in the moment. So first of all, 1882, very clear. They're reacting to the horrors of pogroms, which is, this is also, I think it was 1884 1884. I got to remember exact. I think it was 1884 when the Dreyfus Affair. Pardon me for missing the exact date, but it's when in the Dreyfus Affair when they are castigating Alfred Dreyfus for being a traitor. Instead of calling him a traitor against France, they're saying Jew. And that is what this group is also responding to. They're like, when will you see the rest of the world doesn't want us? Okay, so go ahead and read a little bit more.
Where is your ancient pride, your old spirit? Remember that you were a nation possessing a wise religion, a law, a constitution, a celestial temple, whose wall is still a silent witness to the glories of the past. Your state in the West is hopeless. The star of your future is gleaming in the East. Deeply conscious of all the foregoing and inspired by the true teaching of our great master Hillel. If I do not help myself, who will help me? We propose to form the following society for national ends.
All right, so hold on just a second before we go, right? So what's this sound like? Wait, what is it, Candy? What does this sound like?
Colonialism and nationalism.
Interesting, right?
The ascendancy of all that again, and the bringing back of former glory.
Nationalism
And your permanence. And
What?
and permanence, bringing back to your former glory and permanence of what was.
Okay, interesting. Good. Jay, what are you hearing here?
It seems to me that every time we kind of get comfortable feeling that we're welcome wherever we're living, that, to use the metaphor from Fiddler on the Roof, that we are in a very precarious situation always. And just as we get comfortable, as this paragraph keeps saying, there's a spark of fire. They mentioned it, that spark of fire again and again and again, because that's exactly what happens to us. The German Jews during World War II felt they're not going to bother us. We're German, more than we're Jews. But every time there's that spark of fire reminding us how important it is for us to have a country behind us.
All right, wonderful. What else? Anybody hear anything else? Because clearly there's resonance. So there's modern resonance. There's this perpetual resonance. But any other sort of historical moment, I'm thinking of the Maccabees. You could literally rewrite this out of the book of Maccabees. It is the same thing. Don't assimilate. Look at what assimilate does. Don't you remember that you're unique? Don't you remember that they don't want you in the world? So you think that the answer is to assimilate and become more like them? They will only send you out just like they did with the Jews in Spain and the auto da fe, right? That was, we talked about that period in history. Well, guess what? It could happen again, and it's going to happen again now. And what literally happened? What literally happened? This is 1882. In just 70 years later, right? Not even 70 years later, right? It was the greatest catastrophe, human catastrophe, that the world had ever seen in the Shoah. Okay,
This is exactly. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say this is exactly when Sherry and I's great grandparents emigrated to Minnesota from Odessa.
St. Louis Park.
No, St. Paul, but yeah.
Yeah. The great exodus. There were so many great exoduses, and St. Louis Park was one of them. So it's good,
yes.
right?
Yes, it was.
About this time, people coming to America.
Is there a novel about this?
Yeah, any good books to?
Ooh, I don't know. That's a great question.
Is this not something we should be thinking about today?
Ugh.
Right?
Right?
So doesn't it make you feel like maybe there's something here, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Some people were feeling that, in the latest political election cycle, or perhaps even currently, right? That they're saying, people, don't you hear that some of this stuff is kind of boiling?
Like they're there. There's the drums are being sounded and we're not paying attention because
Or Alice,
comfortable, or we are,
or we
Yeah.
have a state of Israel,
right.
or
State of
things are
Israel.
different. Things are very different. This is kind of like what Jay had brought up, you know, very like, if we don't have Israel, where else are we going to go, right? 7 million, 8 million people, 14 million people. We're 0.2% of the world population. We are less than 1%. We are 0.2% of the world population. Where else are we going to go? Right?
We could
So-
find ourselves without the homes that we love so dearly if we're
Could,
not vigilant.
right? Or
Yeah.
there is a
Or we all leave and go to Israel.
Jay and then Candy.
Yeah, based on being expelled from most countries of the world, the Arab countries, Europe, we've almost been forced into like a ghetto that we've turned into a paradise. We've been forced into this land for safety, for some security. And again, we turned it into, rather than the Warsaw Ghetto, we turned it into a wonderful place. But that's what sort of happened. The world has pushed us out, whether it was Russia, Poland, you know, everyone else knows the other countries.
Well, it's great. We're going to talk about the political maneuvering that precipitated the creation of the state of Israel, including the fact, I think I'll try to find the documents that talk about all the different places that Herzl was thinking of. Uganda, Arizona, Alaska. Like, there were tons of places that they were willing to consider for a Jewish state because they knew, right? Here's what you don't hear in this Bilu document. This Bilu document is about to say, go home, because that's the place, right? Herzl says, look, we want to go home, but if we can't go home, we got to go somewhere. So give us something. Uganda will be just fine. Thank you very much, right? And the only reason that Uganda was possible, speaking of colonialism, right, is because it was a colony. Yeah, it was a colony. And the land of Israel was it wasn't really a colony because there was always indigenous people living in the land, and the Arab nations weren't really ever colonialized. I mean, that's Lawrence of Arabia story, right? But there's a heck of a very interesting sort of dynamic change that's happening. But back to Alice's point, which is so important, we got to be listening to this today, right? This is part of the sort of like heartthrob of the Jewish people. Any other comments? Did we lose Candy? I think we lost Candy. She had to go. All right. So let's finish it up. Alice, you ready?
Sure.
Okay, hold on. Go ahead.
The society will be named Bilu according to the motto, House of Jacob, come, let us go. It will be divided into local branches according to the numbers of its members. The seat of the committee will be Jerusalem. Donations and contributions shall be unfixed and unlimited.
It's such a Jewish organization. Right?
Truly.
Like, I read this and I was like, oh my God, right? They're smart, right? But like also like this had to be in the charter of all the important things that they were talking about. They were like, Jews,
Right.
get out of pogrom infested Europe, but donations will be unfixed and unlimited. All right, go ahead.
We want, 1, a home in our country. It was given to us by the mercy of God. It is ours as registered in the archives of history. 2, to beg it of the Sultan himself, and if it be impossible to obtain this, to beg that we may at least possess it as a state within a larger state, the internal administration to be ours, to have our civil and political rights, and to act with the Turkish Empire only in foreign affairs, so as to help our brother Ishmael in his time of need. We hope that the interests of our glorious nation will rouse the national spirit in rich and powerful men, and that everyone, rich or poor, will give his best labors to the holy cause. Greetings, dear brothers and sisters. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and our land Zion is our only hope. God be with us, the pioneers of Bilu.
Okay,
Hmm.
right? Woohoo!
Wow.
That's some serious hardcore stuff. Very dramatic. Fires of flaming and passion igniting and get out, right? So what happened? Bilu people, the pioneers, they actually did go to Israel. They did get funding from Rothschild. They did try to settle the land. They did try to cultivate the land. They were the early pioneers. When you call them Chalutzim, they were the ones that began to settle the land. And some of the first settlements in pre-Israel, pre-state Israel, were basically manifestations of this Bilu manifesto, and it was in the spirit of this that ultimately precipitates the formation of the World Zionist Congress. So before you get to Herzl on the stage, it's not like Herzl was like, world is totally not paying attention. People were paying attention, and Herzl, with his like unbelievable uncanny gift, took the spirit that was already germinating, forming, and brought it together, and brought the voices of the world together to create the World Zionist Congress, which we're going to speak about next week. Okay, so any other comments or responses to this? Like what caught you? What sort of like captures your attention? There was one piece that we haven't spoken about, which I thought is amazing. When you read this last piece, what does it say about the people that are still the inhabitants of the land? Does it say to dispossess them? On the contrary, it says, look, we understand we are not empowered, but we, like everyone else of the late 19th century, want a nation for ourselves. This was the rise of nationalism, okay? It had obviously its catastrophic consequences in the formation of the National Socialism Party, the Nazis, right, in Germany. But the very concept of itself, of a group of people that can exert self-determination, which has its roots in American foundations of governance and democracy. That is what was inspiring these people to say, let's go to this land and let's have our nation, but we understand it's not our land. So give us a little part of it. And we're going to be your brothers. If you need us to defend for whatever reason that you need us, we're there with you. What an amazing charter. Kind of like isn't it? It sounds like doesn't it feel upside down a little bit? Doesn't it feel like, wait a minute, here are people that are saying they're willing to like blend in with the sort of Turkish and Muslim majority. And today when we're talking about Israel, we're talking about some like, amazing Jewish majority, which by the way, there's only 7 million people. And we know that like, there's 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. Okay. Besides the neighboring countries, of which there are vastly larger millions of people. So it seems like it's kind of upside down, doesn't it? So an interesting piece. Any other comments or responses to this? Yeah, Judy.
Every time I hear the numbers like that were 0.2% of the population, it astounds me how much influence we have on the world.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in positive, and it's also the sort of like, it makes you wonder why there's so much hatred, animosity against such a small percentage. It's a 0.2% is not even a statistical anomaly, right? You can't even, you can miss by 0.2% and it doesn't even make a difference in statistics. That's how small these people are, our people are. And yet there's a vastly disproportionate influence in everything that is important and valuable in the sort of human project. Yeah. That's what makes it big deal.
And the technical and medical advances that have come from Israel in its short time period is astounding.
Yeah. And even more, right? There's all the stuff that we don't know yet. Yes, Lauren.
I think yesterday, Sunday morning, we watched it later in the day. people who are doing a study of the Holocaust. They're putting out a film and what was going on in the United States during the Holocaust, how people like Charles Lindbergh was spewing like all this. And I mean, here's this American hero, and he's spewing out all this anti-Semitism, and people are listening to him. And people knew what was going on in the concentration camps, and yet turning their backs, and they weren't allowing people in. And yet when they showed the liberation of the camps, it's like people couldn't believe what they were seeing. And I think they end the film with, is it Charlottesville? The Jews will not replace us, Jews. I mean, it's like frightening that we've come such a long way and we've come nowhere.
Is this Ken Burns?
Yes, Ken Burns. Yes,
Right.
yes.
So he hit a splash. By the way, have you subscribed yet to the Daily Alert?
No.
This was one of my recommendations. So I'm sure that your emails get flooded every day. So look at the syllabus, find the Daily Alert, and definitely subscribe to it, because it will help keep your mind paying attention to matters relating to Israel. Okay. And so you won't miss these, really kind of like important moments. Like Ken Burns is a major, biographer or historiographer, right? And like, it's interesting how it's celebrated and also critiqued in some respects. All right, so we're going to go to the last text today, which some of you may have read before, but it's a really great text when we're talking about how did we get here. This is actually written, I think, in the 1960s, okay, by Shai Agnon. Shmuel Yosef Agnon was an author laureate of Israel, and he was an amazing fictional writer of the sort of Jewish ethos, particularly around the formation of the state in the early years of the country. And this is a very famous story called Maaseh Ha'ez, the fable of the goat. Sassy, you want to read?
Sure. The fable of the goat. The tale is told of an old man who groaned from his heart. The doctors were sent for, and they advised him to drink goat's milk. He went out and bought a she-goat and brought her into his home. Not many days passed before the goat disappeared. They went out to search for her, but did not find her. She was not in the yard, not in the garden, not on the roof of the study house, and not by the spring, not in the hills, and not in the fields. She tarried several days and then returned by herself. And when she returned, her udder was full of a great deal of milk, whose taste was as the taste of Eden. Not just once, but many times she disappeared from the house. They would go out and search for her and would not find her until she returned by herself with her udder full of milk that was sweeter than honey and whose taste was the taste of Eden. One time the old man said to his son, "My son, I desire to know where she goes and when she brings this milk, which is sweet to my palate and a balm to all my bones." His son said to him, "Father, I have a plan." He said to him, "What is it?" The son got up and brought a length of cord he tied to the goat's tail. His father said to him, "What are you doing, my son?" He said to him, "I am tying a cord to the goat's tail so that when I feel a pull on it, I will know that she has decided to leave, and I can catch the end of the cord and follow her on her way." The old man nodded his head and said to him, "My son, if your heart is wise, my heart too will rejoice."
So pause just for a moment before you continue reading. This is an allegory of the state of Israel. Okay? So you have to read this. Right now you're just reading about an old man and a son and a goat. Okay? But you have an old man who represents the old world. You have a young man who has a dream of settling the land, and you have a goat. Okay? And the goat it remains to be seen what the goat is, its function is. But we know at this moment that what we're trying to discover in this story is that somehow this is going to help us understand What did it mean to return to the land of Israel with an old man, his son, and a goat? Okay, who has this, and the goat has special milk, right? That comes from like a special place, and it brings the man healing, the old man healing. Okay. Let's see. I love your reading. Do you want to keep on reading?
No, could someone else read?
Sure. How about Barbara? Do you want to read?
The youth tied the cord to the goat's tail and minded it carefully. When the goat set off, he held the cord in his hand and did not let it slacken until the goat was well on her way and he was following her. He was dragged along behind her until he came to a cave. The goat went into the cave and the youth followed her holding the cord. They walked thus for an hour or two, maybe even a day or two. The goat wagged her tail and bleated, and the cave came to an end. When they emerged from the cave, the youth saw lofty mountains and hills full of the choicest fruit, and a fountain of living waters that flowed down from the mountains, and the wind wafted all manner of perfumes. The goat climbed up a tree by clutching at the ribbed leaves. Carob fruits full of honey dropped from the tree, and she ate of the carobs and drank of the garden's fountain. The youth stood and called to the wayfarers. I adjure you, good people, tell me where I am, and what is the name of this place? They answered him, you are in the land of Israel, and you are close by Spot. The youth lifted up his eyes to the heavens and said, blessed be the omnipresent, blessed be he who has brought me to the land of Israel. He kissed the soil and sat down under the tree. He said, until the day breath and the shadows flee away.
Breathe. It is breathe.
Oh, till the days breathe. Until the day
breathe
and the shadows flee away, I shall sit on the hill under this tree, and I shall go home and bring my father and mother to the land of Israel. As he was sitting thus and feasting his eyes on the holiness of the land of Israel, he heard a voice proclaiming, come, let us go out to greet the Sabbath queen. And he saw men like angels wrapped in white shawls with boughs of myrtle in their hands, and all the houses were lit with a great many candles. He perceived that the eve of Sabbath would arrive with the darkening, and that he would not be able to return. He uprooted a reed and dipped it in gallnuts, from which the ink for the writing of Torah scrolls is made. And he took a piece of paper and wrote a letter to his father. From the ends of the earth I lift up my voice in song to tell you that I have come in peace to the land of Israel. Here I sit, close by Spot, the holy city, and I imbibe its sanctity. Do not inquire how I arrived here, but hold on to this cord, which is tied to the goat's tail, and follow the footsteps of the goat. Then your journey will be secure, and you will enter the land of Israel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Lori, you want to continue reading us and get us to the end?
The youth rolled up the note and placed it in the goat's ear. He said to himself, when she arrives at father's house, father will pat her on the head and she will flick her ears. The note will fall out. Father will pick it up and read what is written on it. Then he will take up the cord and follow the goat to the land of Israel. The goat returned to the old man, but she did not flick her ears, and the note did not fall. When the old man saw that the goat had returned without his son, he clapped his hands to his head and began to cry and weep and wail, my son, where are you? My son would that I might die in your stead, my son, my son. So he went weeping and mourning over his son, for he said, an evil beast has devoured him, my son, and secretly rent in pieces. And he refused to be comforted, saying, I will go down to my grave in mourning for my son. And whenever he saw the goat, he would say, woe to the father who banished his son, and woe to her who drove him from the world. The old man's mind would not be at peace until he sent to the butcher to slaughter the goat. The butcher came and slaughtered the goat. As they were skinning her, the note fell out of her ear. The old man picked up the note and said, my son's handwriting. When he had read all that his son had written, he clapped his hands to his head and cried, Ishmael. Woe to the man who robs himself of his own good fortune, and woe to the man who requites good with evil. He mourned over the goat many days and refused to be comforted, saying, Woe to me, for I could have gone up to the land of Israel in one bound, and now I must suffer out my days in exile. Since that time, the mouth of the cave has been hidden from the eye, and there is no longer a short way. And that youth, he has not died, shall bear fruit in his old age, full of sap and richness, calm and peaceful in the country of light.
Thank you. So I know it's a lot of reading. And I don't know, have you heard this story before? Have you read this? Okay, so I know we're just reading it the first time. It's worth reading again and a couple other times, because it's just kind of like, it's heartbreaking, right? You want to hear the story of like the guy who finds the land of Israel and it's flowing with milk and honey and everything's great and he's got it perfect. He's like, I want to go get my dad. He's sick, and if he comes here, everything that he needs to live and to thrive and to live out his days in health is here, and I'm going to put it in the ear of the goat, because the goat's, what, I'm going to tie it to its neck? I'm going to put it in the ear, and if he pats it on its head, the thing is going to fall out, and boom, right? And of course, what happens? He misses the thing. So, obviously, we could locate the failure in the letter, the little note falling out of the ear at the right time. And maybe we could have said, oh, he should have done it differently or something like that, okay? Or we can locate the failure in the sort of the reaction of the father, who was so immediately concerned with the son. Why didn't he shake the goat? What did you do to my son? And then out drops the thing, right? Decides to just kill the damn thing. He decides to just kill the damn thing before he realizes what was really happening. And that is a very important part of the story. When was this written? You remember? 1966. What happens in 1967?
We have the war.
The 6-Day War happens. What happens in the 6 days? So from 1948 to 1966, the Jews have their state of Israel. And here is Shai Agnon, the great writer of fiction of Jewish life, and he's writing about a longing he's living in Israel at the time. He's writing about a longing from the old country, because people are seeing that even though they have this land, it's still not a fulfillment of them. By the way, parenthetically, if you also know this piece, which we'll bring up, the American Jewish community was not so hot on the establishment of the State of Israel between 1948 and 1966. It was even so much that the Reform movement was actually not in favor of the state for quite a long time, until 1967. In 1967, for which most of you had a pretty good experience of, it was the moment. It changed everything. It changed everything because there was this strategic military victory, because it reclaimed the city of Jerusalem, because there was a tremendous sense of self-autonomy and also self-protection that meant that they could withstand the forces that came from all sides and defeat it decisively in 6 days, right? This was a different Israel than it had ever seen before. And I wonder if Shai Agnon wrote another story after this one, because this one is so powerful, because there's something that even enters into that. Even though we're the beneficiaries of just one more year of experience, just one more year of experience, to know that that if the man was a little bit more faithful, he would have been basking in the sort of, sweetness and the abundance of a land at peace. If he had just had one more year, a little bit more faith. And one of the issues here in the story, I see you, Pam, the story is that somehow, even with all of the efforts of how we got here, there is this kind of ambivalence, a kind of insecurity, uncertainty about the state of Israel. And it's that uncertainty that even animates the conversation that we have today. Pam, what'd you want to say?
Why didn't the kid go back and get his dad?
Because it was Shabbat.
Oh. But he could have gone the next day, right?
He could have. You're right. Barbara.
To me, there is a parallel to Moses not being let into the land of Israel and that generation not fully being able to enter the land of Israel, that this is the youth, that this is this next generation that has the ability to get there and that he really couldn't. And that's just what I read into it.
It's a wonderful thing. And at another point, another time, there's such a beautiful midrash about Moses actually like arguing with God for a very, very long time about actually being allowed to settle in the land. And it's really, really a powerful kind of like, what would happen if, and almost part of the story is like, it just could never happen that way. That's a really great thing. Jay, and then unfortunately we got to say goodbye.
Okay. Yeah, that line about woe to the man who robs himself of his own good fortune, whether it's 1966 or today, although Israel isn't perfect, I think people have to be real careful not to recognize our good fortune to have this country, that we have this gift of Israel, and we have an army, because our history tells us that otherwise we'll be killed and we'll be slaves, we'll be in exile. So I think it's just a reminder that to the Jews who don't recognize the importance of Israel today, that we have this gift, and woe to anyone who doesn't recognize it.
Yeah, so great, really, right? That's such a really important point. Is that like we're in a day where it's like we're just so blessed, right? And if we lose the sort of appreciation for that blessing, it's difficult. And then it's about what I hope we can accomplish in our class is how do you talk to the person that doesn't get it, right? Because you can't just clobber them over the head anymore. You can't just clobber them and say like, you have to, you remember the Holocaust, right? Remember all the struggles. You can't do that. You've got to, there's something about the sweetness of the promised land that the youth need to taste and see for themselves. Have a wonderful week. I have to jet off to another meeting. I'm leaving this Zoom room for another Zoom room. But I hope that you all have a great week, and we will see you next week with the big story of the political formation of the state.
Great. Thank you, Josh.
When do we get to hear your good